When we last left the Star Trek film series, it was at its nadir, its absolute rock bottom with Star Trek Nemesis, a critical and financial failure that killed the franchise dead. After Star Trek Nemesis, there was no more Star Trek in movie theaters, and soon enough, no more Star Trek on television screens either, with the equally underwhelming end of Star Trek Enterprise. For several years, the Star Trek franchise was just done. It was just done. But now here we are in 2013, and as Bruce Springsteen said, these are better days, baby. And these are better days thanks to the ingenuity of one particular filmmaker named J.J. Abrams. J.J. Abrams was called upon by Paramount to rejuvenate the Star Trek franchise, to make new Star Trek movies. And he did this by going all the way back to the beginning, by reaching back to the very origins of Star Trek on television and remaking Star Trek starring its original cast of characters. Captain Kirk, Spock, Dr. McCoy, Sulu, Uhura, Chekhov, Scotty, the whole original cast. He went back, he returned to these characters, he recast these characters with new, young, fresh actors, and he restarted the Star Trek franchise. And this was something that was so badly needed. I've spoken in previous reviews in this series about the effects that can be had by a fresh coat of paint. I said that Star Trek First Contact, with the new Enterprise and the new uniforms, the new set designs, etc., felt like a fresh coat of paint. And that, even more so, is what J.J. Abrams' Star Trek represents. It is a fresh coat of paint. And that has such a strong and immediately noticeable effect. You take this familiar, in some cases very tired, well-worn material, and you rejuvenate it. You present it in a way that it hasn't been presented before. You show us things that it hasn't shown us before, but yet are still familiar. So Star Trek 2009 is seen as a first step in a new franchise. And it gets that new franchise started off on a very strong, very encouraging foot, where you can watch this movie and think, okay, this is good. I can get behind this. I can see myself seeing more of these movies, you know. I can see myself watching, if they decide to do television series set in this version of Star Trek, I can see myself following this. This is exciting. This is new. This is promising. And that's really quite an accomplishment, considering how absolutely dead, both creatively and commercially, Star Trek was on TV and at the movies before the Abrams Star Trek. And while this Star Trek movie is an introduction to a new series, a new phase in the franchise with new takes on these old characters, it also is a part of the existing Star Trek franchise and continues a pattern that you can detect in those films that I've talked about earlier in these reviews, and that is the return to form. Star Trek 2009 is a very strong example of the return to form that we see throughout the Star Trek film series, whether the movie preceding it was just a complete piece of shit or was just a little underwhelming. The first example of that is Star Trek II, which followed this sort of mediocre Star Trek the Motion Picture. Then we have Star Trek VI, which followed Star Trek V, which by the general consensus is the worst of the Star Trek films. That's not my opinion, but that is the general feeling. And then Star Trek First Contact, which came right after Star Trek Generations, which I consider one of the very worst and is, at least in most people's opinions, an underwhelming, mediocre film. So Star Trek movies have this pattern of returning to form, of following really disappointing outings with really impressive outings. And the Abrams Star Trek is the most recent, and in many ways, if you go by the degree of improvement, the best example of that, because it goes from the absolute worst of all the Star Trek movies, the dreary and boring and just all-around disappointing Star Trek Nemesis, to the new and fresh and exciting Star Trek by J.J. Abrams. It's a really promising restart. What makes it so great? Well, there's that fresh coat of paint I mentioned before. All of the actors cast in the roles are very interesting and very exciting. Chris Pine makes a great Captain Kirk. He doesn't try to imitate William Shatner. He doesn't try to fill those shoes. He plays Kirk in his own way. There are a few touches here and there that feel kind of Shatnery, but overall, it is not like a Shatner performance at all. It's Chris Pine taking the character as he sees him, doing his own thing. He makes a really, really good Captain Kirk. Same thing with Zachary Quinto. Zachary Quinto, you could say, is maybe a little closer to Nimoy's version of Spock than Chris Pine is to Shatner's version of Kirk, but he still carves out his own space. Quinto's Spock has his emotions much closer to the surface than Nimoy's Spock. He's much more volatile. But of course, in this movie, he also has many more emotional scenes to play than Nimoy had in most of the Star Trek movies. He's terrific. And then beyond that, the rest of the cast are sort of laid down in supporting roles. They don't have a whole lot to do. Carl Urban as McCoy is a lot of fun, is mostly there for comic relief. He doesn't have a lot to do in terms of the actual story, but does a terrific job. Simon Pegg as Scotty is great. The rest of the supporting cast is excellent in relatively minor roles. Zoe Saldana as Uhura is perfectly fine. John Cho as Sulu, Anton Yelchin as Chekhov, and the script is able to find space for all of them to have their little moments. Like Uhura has her bit where she's able to use her exceptional ear to translate the Romulan transmissions. Chekhov is able to use the transporter to beam Kirk back to the ship while they're falling. Kirk and Sulu. Sulu has the sword fight with the Romulans on board the drill in the atmosphere above Vulcan, and Scotty has some fun things to do with Kirk and old Spock, original Spock, on the ice planet, and then also on board the ship. So I mean, they all have their little moments, which is something that some of the previous films weren't. They weren't always so good at that, finding little spaces for the crew other than Kirk and Spock and McCoy to show their characters and to have things to do. And this movie does that very well. And also, I must mention, as a longtime fan of his, Bruce Greenwood. Bruce Greenwood as Captain Pike in this is just fantastic. Really shows what a great example that character is for young Captain Kirk. I think it's very important in this movie, since we have a very young Kirk just starting out in Starfleet, that we show him having a really strong role model as a commander and sort of as a surrogate father figure. And Captain Pike, played by Bruce Greenwood, is absolutely that. You almost wish that you could see him a little bit more, that the following movie he would still be in command, that they would take a little bit longer and maybe bringing Kirk along as the captain and give us Captain Pike a little bit more, because he is such a strong, impressive character in command of the ship. And again, Bruce Greenwood, one of my very, very favorite actors, plays him absolutely splendidly. There were some hardcore Star Trek fans who did not like this movie, and they had all kinds of reasons for not liking it, and it's all a matter of taste, so I can't say that they're wrong, but judging the movie as I judged, I consider their objections to be bullshit. To be butthurt nerd bullshit. Because some of them said things like, well, it just doesn't feel like a Star Trek movie. It just doesn't feel like the other movies. The music is different. I wish I had more of the Alexander Courage music or the Jerry Goldsmith music. And to me, that sort of misses the point. That this movie is supposed to be different. It was designed to be different. It didn't want to have the Jerry Goldsmith music or the Alexander Courage music. At least not until the end. I mean, at the very end, you hear that original Alexander Courage Star Trek theme used much more prominently than it has been in any of the other Star Trek movies, but you just don't get it until the very end. Most of the score, the Michael Giacchino score, is new themes and original stuff, and I really love it, by the way. The score for this Star Trek is absolutely beautiful. It's one of my favorite, if not my very favorite, of all of the film scores for the Star Trek films. It's just really wonderful. But they say things like that, or then they bitch about how the time travel plot, having Spock go back to the beginning and change things, that it basically erases Star Trek continuity that we've been watching for all these years. They say things like, because of this movie, now the original Star Trek series and the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and all that other stuff, that never happened. It erased it all. It never happened. To which I would respond, none of it ever happened. It was TV shows. It was movies. It's fiction. Somebody just made it all up. None of it ever happened. And in fact, the only way that it ever existed was as TV shows and movies and et cetera, et cetera. And all of those TV shows and movies are still there. If you miss the original Star Trek series, you can go back and watch it anytime you want. This movie did not erase anything. All of the stuff that came before it is still there. You can still go and watch it. It's just as real now, post-Abrams Star Trek, as it ever was. That is a bullshit, stupid, meaningless nerd objection. But a lot of people had that to say. And what really frustrated me about that line of criticism was that if it had been me, if for some reason Paramount had hired me to do the next Star Trek movie instead of the very talented, able J.J. Abrams, I would have done the exact same thing. Except I would not have had old Spock come back and tie it in with the pre-existing Star Trek stuff. To me, that was a gift, or an attempt to give a gift to the fans. To say, okay, you know what? We decided we're going to reboot this thing. We're going to go back and do Captain Kirk again with new actors. But just so we don't feel like we're totally wiping the slate clean, we're going to tie this in with the original existing continuity by having Spock come back and be the catalyst that starts this whole thing off. They didn't have to do that. And again, if it had been me, I would not have bothered even doing that. I would have done everything that they did with this movie. I would have recast all the characters. I would have set it back in that earlier time frame around the era of the beginning of the original series, where everybody's younger, sort of in their 30s and 20s. Redesign the ship, redesign the sets. I would have done all of that, all of the stuff that they did for this movie. But instead of having a plot that ties it in with the pre-existing Star Trek stuff, I would have just come up with a cool Star Trek story and just told it. I would have just, hey, here's Captain Kirk in charge of the Enterprise. Here's Spock. Here's Dr. McCoy. Here's Uhura. Here's Sulu. Everybody would have just sort of been there already in place, and I would have just told a really cool Star Trek story. And I wouldn't have worried about continuity. I wouldn't have worried about how this fits in with the other movies. I wouldn't have cared, because that shit does not matter to me. So that's what I would have done. And the fact that Abrams and his writers were willing to craft the plot of their film in such a way as to incorporate that older Star Trek material that they were rebooting and rewinding away from is, to me, a mark of sensitivity and concern for the fans. And so many of the old school Star Trek fans just gave them the finger for that. And it just goes to show that you can't please all of the people all of the time. And when it comes to sci-fi nerds, you might as well give up, because you won't be able to please them any of the time. So fuck them. Don't make the movie for them. Make the movie as good as you can make it. And that was another thing that Star Trek nerds kind of bitched about was, well, it's like they didn't make the movie for us. No shit, they didn't make the movie for you. Because nothing pleases you people. Because you guys suck. Because you're not happy with anything. That's why they didn't make the movie for you. They made the movie for other people who are possible to please. I apologize if you Star Trek nerds think I'm being too hard on you. I mean, I tape these reviews sort of in batches. And I'm taping this right after I did the Nemesis review, where I downed the Boilermaker. So I may be feeling a little drunk and maybe a little aggressive. So if I hurt your feelings by saying that you suck and nothing pleases you, I apologize for that. I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings. You fucking nerds. Anyway, so Abrams Star Trek, fresh coat of paint, return to form, good cast, very well directed. I like the lens flares. Stylistically, it sort of carves its own path. It goes its own way. I just absolutely love the prologue with the death of Captain Kirk's father on board that ship. I think that is just so beautifully done. From the first shot, when the ship comes into frame in extreme close-up and you see the windows rushing by and with the sound, and it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a starship. It goes rushing by. It's the first thing in the film that you see, and it could be a train. That could be a subway going by. and then it gets out into the distance a little bit, and the camera pulls back, and you see that it's a starship. Just a wonderful opening to the movie, a wonderful opening shot. You hear the sounds of the radio transmissions, the ship talking to Starfleet, etc., and it sounds like astronauts. It sounds like the Apollo crew talking to Houston, Mission Control, with the noises and the radio sound. It's really well done. This is a really good movie. This is a really, really good movie.